Hi everybody, this is Shujaat Mubarik, and this is lecture number 2 of the series of lectures on intellectual capital. And today's lecture's topic is how to identify the intangible resources of an organization. Uh, in today's lecture, we'll be discussing in detail various strategies for the identifying the resources of an organization. But before moving toward our main topic, let me give you a very brief recap of what intellectual capital is and why is it important. In fact, often people confuse the word intellectual capital with intellect. Intellect is the ability or the thinking capacity of a person, which we call it the intellect. Whereas the word intellectual capital is far broader term than intellect. It is comprising of three major things, as we discussed in the previous lecture as well. The first thing is human capital, then it's a relational capital and structural capital. Means the human capital is the capital of an organization which is comprising of the knowledge, skills, abilities, experiences, attitudes, stabilities, compliant behavior, engagement, commitment, all of these aspects of a firm's organization's employees. So this is human capital. So the intellect is in fact covered in the human capital part of the intellectual capital. Then it is relational capital, that comprising of the organization's relations with its suppliers, customers and other stakeholders. And then is process capital, which is which comprising of or which represents the processes of an organization's. Those processes may be unique, may be valuable and effective for the organization. So having said that intellectual capital has three major dimensions: human capital, relational capital and structural capital, it is important to identify the resources of organizations, what the strategy we should use, and how these intangible resources are going to be fitted or how they are going to stand with the rest of the resources of the organization. So today's lecture is basically dedicated to this. So let me just move forward by just showing you some of the major thing here. If you just see here the slides showing that what are the resources which can be identified by a company, or what are the resources to which a company has access. So primarily we can divide the resources of an organization into two parts. One is the traditional physical resources of organizations, and the others are the intangible resources. You can see on the back side of the slides that traditional economic resources are the physical resources. Obviously, it includes the machinery, it includes the building, it includes all the physical resources or the assets of an organization, as well as it includes the monetary resource like the bank balance, like the equity of the organization's financial stability of the organization and all that. So these are called the traditionally economic resources of an organization, which are also called tangible resources. And then comes the intangible resources category, or which we call it the intellectual capital, or the intellectual resources, which I told you that are comprising of the three things: human capital, relational capital and structural capital. So if you ask me, and if you ask to the author of this book, in fact there are three authors, Roos, Pike and Lisa. So these three authors have also mentioned that an organization has five types, or the five categories of resources. So these are the five categories of resources. Number one is monetary resource, number two is physical resource, number three is human capital or human resource, relational resource or relational capital, and process resource or process capital. In fact, throughout our lectures, word resource and capital would be used interchangeably, but I prefer to use the capital as it's a more comprehensive word and it better capitalize the resources, both the tangible and intangible. So in this way you can see that there are the five major resources of an organization, which in fact forms the resource portfolio of an organization. Now the point is that what can be the resource portfolio of an organization and how we can identify. There are the various methods in fact to identify the resources of an organization, but today we are going to discuss the one method which is called resource distinction tree, RDT. So RDT is a method through which we can identify the resources of an organization, whether those resources are capitals, are tangible, are intangible, right? So don't be confused with my pronunciation of OR or and ARER. So I'm just telling you that either this RDT, resource distinction tree, is used for organizations identification of resources, both either they are intangible or they are intangible. So all the 5 categories or whatever, if they are the broader categories, it is used. Resource decision tree is basically, obviously it's obvious from its name that decision tree means that it would be something which has a kind of a broader trunk, and it would have a certain branches, and then the branches would have the leaves. So it would be first a narrow one resource, maybe the organization have the various branch resources, then branch resources have the various sub resources, they are the leaves. So like a tree, the resource of an organization would be expanding. So that's why it's called the resource decision tree. Now resource decision tree says that if you want to identify the something which is a resource of an organization, that thing or that element should have 4 characteristics or the 4 capabilities. It means that if I am in my organization and I want to see that what is a resource for my organization, so that resource, and if I categorize that thing as resource of my organization, that thing should have 4 elements. For example, if I am in a fertilizer manufacturing company and I want to see that whether my relationship with my supplier are resource or not. So in order to categorize those relationships with the supplier as a resource or not, what the elements should be present over there. So there are the 4 elements. Number 1 is distinct. Obviously distinct means it should be different, it should be identifiable, it should be unique. You can somehow you can relate, or somehow you can understand, or you can see, or at least you can distinguish. So it's a distinct. So for example, the relationship with the supplier are something which is itself a unique, or it's a distinct element, or a distinct process, or a distinct capability, right? Then it should be a complete, means that completion means that if a transaction is going from A to B, so at least it should have a sense of completeness. It should encapsulate some kind of transaction, or it should have something which can be utilized for some benefits. So that's the completeness. Then it is, to some extent, it should be independent from the sense, obviously none of the resource of an organization is exclusively independent. Means that none of the resource, we can say that it is not dependent upon the rest of the resources. All of the resources of an organization are interdependent, but to some extent those resources also should be independent, right? Because if the resources are 100% interdependent, so this small change in one resource would obviously cascade to the rest of the resources, and it can create problem for the organization. So independence, and then there's the agreeableness. So the 4 categories or 4 capabilities should be there in something, whether it's a physical, tangible, or it's intangible, to be a resource that is distinct, complete, independent, and agreeableness. This is what, according to the author of this particular book. Maybe personally, my opinion is that we can have something more to add, or we can have something more than these 4 things, or maybe we can compromise on one element, because sometimes it's not necessary that all these aspects are present in the resources. But now I'm going to give you one that a quick assignment, or one kind of a quiz, that go or search something in contrast to what the author has mentioned here, the capabilities which should be present in something to be a resource. So, and number one is what you have to look for. Is it necessary to have all these four categories to be a resource? Is it like a spurious kind of thing, or there is something, these capabilities are necessary for a resource to be a resource? So please, this is your quick quiz. Just go on the internet or somewhere, search your book, read your book. I think the internet is the main option. You can go over there and you can search that whether these four elements should be present in the resource to be a resource, or there are some other criteria. So please, you have to answer me on my Google Classroom that whether there are some other criteria for something to qualify being a resource, right? So in fact, according to this book, these are the four major criteria. Okay, now this resource decision tree says that normally the total resource portfolio stands at level 0, and it has two major branches of the resources, which are, you can just see here. One is physical, the other one is intellectual. I have mentioned here, you can mention as intangible. Physical are the traditional resources, have the two categories, and then your intellectual capital are the intangible resources, have the further various categories. So these are the 5 resources. So then further, the monetary resources have the level 3, means that the bank balance, maybe you have investment somewhere, the company has investment in the securities, the company has some debt securities, receivables, and a lot more. There may be the monetary resources. Physical resources can have a building, machinery, maybe plants, something. So a lot can be in the physical resources, and even there can be a subtype of the physical resources. For example, there is a factory. Within the factory, there are a lot of things. There is land and machinery and a lot of other things. So in this way, if above is one resource which is physical, it has been broken into 2 parts, which is it's a traditional and which has been broken into 2 parts, monetary and physical. Further, physical has many parts, like for example machinery, it has a building, it's a plant. Then those, each resource can have further been broken into the parts, like if there is a plant can have many sub resources, right? So in this way we can build the resource portfolio of an organization, right, with the help of the resource distinction tree, RDT. Maybe I pronounced it as a resource decision tree, so if I pronounced it as a resource decision tree, please pardon me, because it's a resource distinction tree, RDT. Now, why to do so and how it's going to help us? In fact, resource decision tree is going to first of all document all of the resources available to an organization, right? Sometimes we have a resources but we don't know, especially in term of your intangible resources. Let's come, for example, in case of our intellectual capital and relational capital. An organization is working on the governmental jobs, governmental contracts, and some of the employees of that organizations have very good relationship with the governmental officials from where they have taken the contract and to whom they are working with, right? So the organization's employees have very good relationship, very good understanding with the governmental organization to whom or with which they are working. Normally, maybe organization gives value to it, sometimes they give, sometimes they don't. But once you'll be going to document in the resource distinction tree, and then you'll realize, oh, these employees have these departments have a kind of a very good working relationship with my with the party or with my maybe the customer to whom I'm working. So these relationships can improve the coordination between 2 organizations. Organizations can better capitalize in a systematic way those relationships in order to improve the efficiency of those projects and effectiveness. So that's why it's always important to list down, to chalk down the resources of the organization. It is like resource distinction tree is like writing all the capabilities, abilities, skills of an employee. So it's a CV, it's a resume of an organization. What an organization have? What's a resume of resources, you can say, that what an organization has. And in fact, resource decision tree, by looking into the resource decision tree, the capabilities, potentials, and capacities of an organization can be formed. So the author in this book has also they have recommended, and I would also suggest you that if, for example, if you are working, if you are going to chart down the plan of the resources with the help of resource decision tree, try to go into more detail, as much as detail as possible, in order to enlist all of the possible resources. Believe me, I am telling to you, and once those you're working and those you're not working, until unless you're not aware of your resources, you won't be able to deploy them properly. So in order to deploy your resources properly, in order to have a proper strategy to utilize your 100% resources, the first thing is document your resources. And one of the good way is to document with the help of the resource decision tree. All right. So once you have documented, then the step number 2 comes. So the first step is documentation of the resources. So the organization which have not documented the resources, they can have a brainstorming with their employees. They can even talk to their suppliers. They can talk to their customers. That what do you think, that what are the resources which are unique, which we have, what are the intangible resources with whom you give value. And in this process of discussion and deliberations with the employees, with the customers, with the suppliers, and with other relevant stakeholders, an organization can identify and group all of the resources which that organization has. So in this way, this is the step number 1 through which a firm can identify its resources, right? So once the organization has identified the resources, then step number 2 comes, which is the prioritization of the resources. What is prioritization? I'll be just discussing with you, but let me give you a couple of examples of the resources which an organization can have, especially as I have already discussed with you that organizations have physical resources, and most of us know about the physical resources, machinery, building, and all that, but lesser of us know about the intangible resources. So I have just to discuss with you and to share with you some of the subtypes of the intangible resources. For example, the first is the relational resource or the relational capital. The relational, it's obvious from its name. Relational capital is the relationship of an organization with its employees, with its suppliers, with its customers. In fact, a lot of people, while computing or while checking the relational capital, do not take into account the relationship of an organization with its employees. But to me, relationship with employees are also part of the relational capital. Relationship with the employees, relationship with the supplier, relationship with the customer. So these 3 relationships, and obviously the relationship with the rest of the stakeholders, like your government, your bank, maybe your society, these all relationships with the rest of the stakeholders, with all of the stakeholders, this in fact form the relational capital or the relational resource of an organization. Here you could just see that, for example, I have explicitly mentioned the table which have been taken from the book, that customers, suppliers, partners, unions, owners, media, all of the relevant stakeholders, but there are a few, there may be a lot others. So relationship with these relevant stakeholders are called the relational resource. But good relationship, obviously, if there will be the negative relationship, so obviously that resource will be converted into a liability. If you have a bad relationship, for example, with your customer, if you don't have a very good relationship with your supplier, for example, now in case of this coronavirus disease, this pandemic, you know that the companies, those who are having a good relationship with their suppliers, they are able to upkeep their supply chain, right? The companies who have a very well integrated and a collaborative relationship with their suppliers, they are able to get the raw material, or they are able to get the supplies from their supplier, and then they are maintaining their supply chain, and that's why the resilience of their supply chain is entirely dependent upon the relationship with their suppliers. And likewise, those companies which they have the good relationship with the relevant stakeholders, now you could see in this crisis of the humanity, the businesses which are facing the crisis, the companies which have a good relationship, they are better surviving. The companies which have a good relationship with the relevant stock stakeholders, even the companies which have a good relationship with the customers, with suppliers, with the employees, with the rest of the stakeholders, their supply chains, their products, their resilience, their risk management is much better than the companies which do not maintain this kind of thing, right? So that's why you can see that this is a real test of the relationships when this kind of situation comes. So that's why these the relationships with all the stakeholders are called the resources, because these relationships pay you in the hard times. The way now they are paying to the companies who have maintained good relationships. I know a couple of companies. They were very good their relationship with the suppliers. They have even in some time the suppliers were a bit expensive, but since they were having a very good relationship with the supplier, so they kept going with that supplier, and now that supplier is trying to pay off in one way or other to by helping that company. So it's a win-win kind of situation. So that's why relationships are very important entirely. We can have a complete lecture on the relationship management, that would be later in the part of this book. So this is number one. This is a relational resource. And obviously, that if in the personal life, if you just look into life of any individual, relationship is a resource. The person which has a good relationship with his friends, or with his or her friends, or with the family, or with anybody, always enjoy the life. And those relationships, sincere relationships, always pay you. So that's why I would advise you, in the personal life, try to maintain good relationship with your peers, with your family, with all of the persons to whom you are interacting with, and in your organization, if you're doing your business, you have to maintain good relationship with your stakeholders. So this is the number one important vital resource of an organization. Okay, so let me give you another assignment, very quick assignment. Can you just figure me out two companies, maybe globally in any of the country, which have thrived in the world market on the basis of their relationships with the stakeholders? So two companies which have thrived, which have excelled because of good relationship management, and two companies which did not get success, or which were not able to thrive because of the bad relationship with the stakeholders. So you have to give me the name of the four companies. Two, those had good relationship with their stakeholders, all of the stakeholders including suppliers, employees, and whatever customers, those thrived, and two of the companies, those didn't maintain good relationship and they did not excel. So just look for that. I'll be waiting for this assignment. Okay, moving on. So this was a relational capital, the relational resource. Then it comes, the second is which is called organizational resource, or it's called process resource, or it's called the structural resource. It's also called process capital, organizational capital, or structural capital. As I've told you that we are using interchangeably resource and capital. Organizational resource or structural resource or structural capital. Basically, it encompasses, or it represents all of the business processes of an organization. In fact, what happens, that employees leave the organization, right? Employees leave the organization. Obviously, this is how things move on, right? After a few period of time, the employees move on. So, if, for example, if one employee is moving, so that employee is carrying the human capital with him or her, so moving to another organization, right? But there's something which is called institutional memory, or they're called institutional processes or organizational processes, that remains with the organization, right? Some of the organizations have maintained a highly standardized, effective and efficient business processes, right? So those processes are intangible ownership of an organization. So those processes, the efficient and effective processes, can give a competitive edge to that organization as compared to the competitors, right? Why? Because one organization, these the processes which we make in an organization for doing our businesses, it's not just an ordinary thing. Organization takes a lot of time in order to develop the processes which should be efficient and effective. So if one organization has developed the processes which are both cost effective, which are both and efficient as well, cost effective, and they're taking the lesser time with the good quality and all that, so it means that process is resource for that organization. Okay, so then there's I was telling you that institutional memory. Organizations have the histories, there are certain memories, certain things. So on the basis of those intangible memories, the organizations sometimes take their future decisions. So that remains with the organizations. You can just see some of the examples here on the slides. There are the brands like trademarks, even services offerings, product concepts, organizational structures, systems. All these are the resources, and a lot of companies do not reveal their processes, their way of doing business, because that way of doing business may be unique and that's giving them competitive edge. So all of the business processes, branding, trademarks, these all are included in the process capital, which is a part of an organization. So number two. Number three, obviously you know what's number three, but we are going in detail. Number three is that's the human resource, are called human capital. Now this human resource, in fact, here in my slides I should mention human capital. It is basically the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the employees of an organization, right? It's not only the knowledge, skills, abilities of the employees of an organization, but it also includes a lot more list. In fact, I have one major component of my PhD thesis was on the identification of the various human capabilities and skills. So I noted that one firm, at least, there are the 9 major dimensions of human capital, which we call it human capital, and they have 36 sub dimensions, right? So this we have identified through proper scientific inquiry, and the paper which I am going to share with you, you can download the paper from the link given in this YouTube video. That paper has been published in a social indicator journal, titled Human Capital for SMEs, Human Capital Development for SMEs, What Matters. So we, in that particular research paper, we in fact found that there are the 9 major dimensions of the human capital, which is education, experience. You can just see education, experience, training, stability, personal attributes, attitudes, compliance, health, and skills, etc. So these are the major capabilities of the employees, are the major resources which organization can use for the benefit. And we can make, even we developed the human capital index with the help of those resources, but later on we'll be having a discussion on that. But let me here conclude this discussion that organizations, we in fact started the discussion from the intellectual capital, which comprises of the human capital, intellectual capital, and process capital. And I told you that the word intellect is covered in the human capital. Then we moved on to the resource distinction tree, which is used for enlisting all of the resources of an organization. It works in a tree format. You have a main resource, then you have a sub-resource, sub-resource, and then their branches. So it works in like a tree. So that's why it's called the resource decision tree. So with the help of the resource decision tree, we can identify all of the resources of an organization. Once we have identified all of the resources of an organization, then in the step number 2, we move toward the prioritization of those resources, right? But before going toward the prioritization, I discussed with you various sub dimensions of the resources. As I told you that you already know about the physical resource and monetary resource, so I told you the sub dimensions of the 3 major resources: human capital, structural capital, and this relational capital. That what are the various sub dimensions, right? So with the help of the resource distinction tree, once you have identified your major resource and then your sub resources, then in step number 2, it is very important to prioritize, to know that what is most important resource for your organization and what's the least important resource, right? So that's the prioritization of the resource in the step number 2. So that prioritization of the resources can be done by several ways. One, it is basically a scientific process through which prioritization of these resources is done, and there's a complete discipline of mathematics which deals with this prioritization, and we call that particular group of techniques as multi-attribute data management or multi-criteria data management approaches, which are basically used for the prioritization purpose. So in the next lecture exclusively I'll be discussing how to prioritize the resources of an organization and how we can develop an index, and technique which I'll be just discussing, that would be analytical hierarchical process. Primarily I've already developed a couple of lectures on AHP. I'm just putting a link in this YouTube video. You can just click on the link in order to know what AHP is. But nevertheless, in my next lecture I'll be just giving you a detail that how AHP can, analytical hierarchical process, which is a one approach in the multi-attribute data management family, work for the prioritization of the resources, right? So till now I think it's enough. We have discussed, we revised IC and its importance, we revised the dimension of the intellectual capital, and we discussed a bit about the resource distinction tree. Thank you very much. Stay blessed, and I'll again suggest you that please stay at your home. Do not go outside, because now the world is facing a very critical time, and this is a responsibility of all of us to help first of all ourselves, and then to help others, right? And stay at home and connect with the team.